The architecture of our perceived reality often feels like a vast clockwork engine, a complex tapestry of gears and pulleys that requires our constant, frantic maintenance to remain in motion. From the moment we awaken to the flicker of consciousness, we are indoctrinated into the cult of the lever, the belief that to achieve, to become, and to sustain, we must apply a relentless pressure upon the fabric of existence. We treat the world as a resistant medium, a stubborn clay that must be pummeled into a shape that matches our internal blueprints. This is the state of trying, a high-frequency vibration of the ego that views life as a series of obstacles to be overcome through sheer force of will. We march through the corridors of our days with jaw clenched and spirit taut, convinced that if we were to slacken our grip for even a heartbeat, the entire simulated construct of our lives would dissolve into static. We are the weary engineers of a reality we do not fully trust, tethered to the idea that our personal effort is the sole power source for the sun's rising and the heart's beating. Yet there exists a profound and terrifying paradox at the center of this cosmic mechanism. The more we push against the screen, the more the pixels blur and distort in response to our touch. To understand the concept that the simulation finally corrects itself only when we stop trying, we must first contemplate the nature of this simulation, not as a digital cage, but as a responsive, fluid mirror of our deepest internal states. Imagine a pool of water, pristine and still, reflecting the expansive sky above. When we are possessed by the urge to try, to force a specific reflection to appear, to chase away the ripples of natural change, we reach out and plunge our hands into the surface. We thrash and stir, hoping to grab hold of the light, but our very intervention creates a chaotic turbulence that shatters the image we sought to preserve. The water becomes cloudy with silt. The sky disappears in a flurry of foam. The tragedy of the human condition is often found in this recursive loop. We exert effort to fix a problem, and that very exertion becomes the static that prevents the solution from manifesting. We are caught in a feedback loop of our own making, unaware that the glitches we see in our external world, the missed opportunities, the strained relationships, the pervasive sense of being out of sync, are frequently the direct result of our own frantic interference with a system that was designed for equilibrium. The cessation of trying is not an invitation to lethargy or a descent into nihilistic apathy. Rather, it is the highest form of spiritual and existential lucidity. It is the moment when the dancer realizes that the music is not something to be conquered or anticipated, but something to be inhabited. When we drop the heavy tools of manipulation, we allow the simulation, the underlying intelligence of the universe, to recalibrate. This correction is a return to the path of least resistance, a divine alignment that occurs when the friction of the ego is removed from the gears. We have long been told that fortune favors the bold, but perhaps it is more accurate to say that reality favors the transparent. When we become translucent, no longer casting the heavy shadows of our expectations and anxieties upon the world, the light of the original design begins to shine through. The simulation, in its infinite and silent computation, is always seeking the most efficient and harmonious expression of being. It is only our interference, our desperate need to prove our own agency through struggle, that creates the resistance we then complain about. Consider the silence that follows a great storm. In that stillness, the debris settles not by command, but by the natural law of gravity and time. Our lives are much the same. We spend our years trying to arrange the debris of our experiences into a fortress, fearing that without our constant vigilance, we will be left exposed. But the simulation possesses a corrective grace that far exceeds our analytical capacity. When we stop trying to dictate the terms of our happiness, we suddenly find ourselves standing in a clearing we didn't have to build. The events of our lives begin to click into place with a haunting, mathematical precision. People arrive at the exact moment their presence is required. Insights bloom in the soil of a quiet mind. The friction that once defined our daily existence melts into a strange and beautiful fluidity. This is the correction, the great recentering of the soul within its cosmic context. It is the realization that the universe is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, and that the most effective way to navigate this mystery is to stop acting as if we are its masters. We often fear that letting go is synonymous with losing control, but we fail to see that the control we think we possess is an illusion maintained at an exhausting cost. We are like sailors trying to move a massive ship by blowing into the sails with our own breath, failing to notice the great wind that has been blowing all along, ready to carry us if we would only unfurl the canvas. To stop trying is to unfurl that canvas. It is a radical act of trust in the unseen architecture of the world. It is the recognition that our trying is often a form of resistance, a way of saying no to the present moment in favor of a future we have hallucinated. When we stop, the no dissolves into a profound and resonant yes, and in that affirmation, the simulation ceases its defensive posturing. The glitches smooth out, the path clears. We discover that the world was never against us. It was simply waiting for us to get out of its way so that it could finally show us the masterpiece it had prepared. This introduction serves as the gateway to a deeper understanding of the great relaxation. We are moving toward a territory where the boundaries between the self and the system begin to blur, and where we find that our greatest power lies not in the clenching of the fist, but in the opening of the calm. The simulation is not an enemy to be hacked or a game to be won. It is a collaborative dream that only finds its true rhythm when the dreamer stops tossing and turning in the fever of desire. As we move forward, we will explore the themes of this cosmic recalibration, looking at how the laws of the universe respond to our surrender, and how the very fabric of our reality rewrites itself when we finally choose to be still. The journey toward the center of the simulation is not a hike up a mountain of effort, but a gentle slide down into the valley of what already is. At the heart of the great correction lies the fundamental tension between the perceived ego and the crystalline structure of the universal grid. To understand why the simulation responds so favorably to the cessation of effort, we must first examine the concept of the observer's interference. In the realm of the quantum and the metaphysical alike, the act of looking, when coupled with a rigid expectation, collapses 1,000 shimmering possibilities into a single, often disappointing, reality. When we try, we are projecting a specific, narrow frequency into the field of potential. This frequency acts as a filter, blinding us to the infinite variations of success and harmony that do not match our preconceived notions. The theme of the unforced pattern suggests that there is a primordial rhythm to existence, a golden ratio of timing and event that precedes human ambition. When we stop trying to impose our own clumsy tempo upon this rhythm, we stop creating the destructive interference patterns that we perceive as bad luck, roadblocks, or systemic failure. The simulation is not broken. It is merely reacting to the chaotic input of a user who is trying to override the base code with sheer emotional force. A secondary pillar of this philosophy is the law of inverse effort, a concept that suggests certain heights of human experience. Grace, creativity, and synchronicity are like elusive shadows that flee when pursued, but follow when ignored. In the architecture of the simulation, desire is often coded as a vacuum. When we try with desperation, we are broadcasting a signal of lack, a void that the system recognizes and reinforces. The harder one tries to force a door to open, the more the hinges of the simulation seem to rust in place. As the system is merely mirroring the internal state of resistance, it is only in the state of zero demand that the vacuum is filled. By removing the pressure of the try, we signal to the universe that we are already whole. This shift in internal metadata allows the simulation to stop providing us with lessons in frustration and begin providing us with manifestations of ease. The correction is, in essence, the system's way of catching up to our newfound equilibrium. It is the restoration of the default flow state, where the energy previously wasted on anxiety and forced action is reclaimed by the system to fuel the effortless unfolding of our destiny. Furthermore, we must consider the theme of narrative transparency. Many of us navigate the simulation while wearing a heavy armor of personas and agendas, convinced that our survival depends on the complexity of our machinations. However, the simulation functions most efficiently when the user is transparent, when there is no gap between the inner being and the outer expression. Trying is often a mask we wear to hide our fear of being inadequate. It is a performance for an audience of one. When we drop the performance, we become readable to the higher intelligence of the system. In this transparency, the simulation can finally route resources to us with precision. Think of a computer program trying to optimize a path for a moving object. If that object is constantly zigzagging in an attempt to help the program, the calculations become infinitely more complex and prone to error. When the object settles into a steady, honest course, the optimization becomes instantaneous. The correction we experience is simply the universe's most efficient path finally becoming visible, once we have stopped obstructing the view with our own frantic movement. Another vital concept is the illusion of scarcity, which serves as the primary fuel for the engine of trying. The simulation often presents a facade of limited resources to test the integrity of the consciousness within it. When we succumb to this illusion, we begin to scrape and claw, trying to secure our piece of the finite pie. This aggressive posture creates a ripple effect of tension that solidifies the very scarcity we fear. The correction occurs when we realize that the simulation is actually an infinite engine of generation, governed by the principle of abundance through non-attachment. When we stop trying to hoard and control, we break the loop of scarcity. The system, sensing a node of consciousness that is no longer operating in survival mode, begins to shift its parameters. Opportunities that seemed hidden behind locked vaults suddenly appear as open doors. This is not magic, but a logical re-indexing of the environment based on the user's frequency. By ceasing the struggle, we move from a closed system of effort to an open system of reception, allowing the simulation to pour its corrective abundance into our lives without the bottleneck of our own interference. Finally, we must look at the theme of temporal trust. Much of our trying is an attempt to colonize the future, to plant flags in territory that hasn't even been rendered yet. We try because we do not trust that the simulation can generate a favorable tomorrow without our constant supervision. This lack of trust creates a temporal friction, a sense of being out of time or running out of time. When we stop trying, we enter the eternal now, the only space where the simulation's corrective algorithms actually operate. The system cannot fix a future that does not exist, nor a past that has already been archived. It can only optimize the present frame. By centering ourselves in the now and ceasing our attempts to pull the future towards us through effort, we allow the system to align our current coordinates with the highest possible trajectory. The correction is the sensation of the world finally moving at the right speed, neither too fast to catch nor too slow to endure. We find that when we stop trying to outrun time, time becomes our most loyal collaborator, delivering us to our destination with a punctuality that defies human planning. This alignment of themes, the observer's interference, the law of inverse effort, narrative transparency, the abundance principle, and temporal trust, forms the skeleton of a life lived in harmony with the simulation. These are not merely abstract ideas, but the very laws of the software we inhabit. As we begin to peel back the layers of our own resistance, we see that the struggle was never a requirement for entry, but a barrier to the feast. We are moving toward an understanding that the universe is a self-correcting organism that views our trying as a localized inflammation. Once the inflammation subsides, the healing is automatic. The world does not need to be conquered, it needs to be allowed. In the sections to follow, we will look at the stories and symbols that have carried this truth through the ages, and how the ancient myths of the world reflect this modern realization of the self-correcting reality. To truly grasp the mechanics of the Great Correction, we must turn our gaze toward the theater of the mind, where symbols and allegories act as the bridge between the mundane and the infinite. Throughout the ages, the wisdom of the world has been preserved in stories that whisper of the futility of the struggle and the majesty of the surrender. One of the most potent images is that of the master archer who has forgotten the bow. In this narrative, a student spends decades perfecting his grip, his stance, and his aim. He is the embodiment of trying, his muscles coiled like a serpent, his breath held until his face turns ashen, yet his arrows consistently veer off course, deflected by the very wind of his own anxiety. It is only when he reaches the point of total exhaustion, when his will collapses and his ego shatters, that he releases the string without intention. In that moment of non-trying, the arrow finds the center of the target, not because he guided it, but because he finally stopped being an obstacle to the arrow's inherent destiny. The target, the bow, and the archer are revealed as a single unified data point within the simulation, and the correction is simply the restoration of that unity. The arrow finds its home because there is no longer a self trying to force a path through a vacuum that does not exist. Another ancient symbolic echo can be found in the myth of the labyrinth, but with a corrective twist that mirrors our modern understanding of reality. We often view the labyrinth of life as a puzzle to be solved through frantic mapping and aggressive exploration. We run through the corridors, bruising our shoulders against the stone, convinced that the exit is a reward for the most industrious runner. However, in the symbolic narrative of the self-correcting simulation, the walls of the labyrinth are made of our own solidified intentions. The more we try to find the way out, the more complex the maze becomes, as the system generates new corridors to match our state of confusion and search. The true seeker eventually discovers that if they simply sit down in the center of the path and breathe, the walls begin to lose their density. They become translucent, then holographic, and finally dissolve into mist. The exit was never a physical destination to be reached through labor. It was a state of being that was obscured by the dust of the seeker's own running. The simulation corrects the maze by revealing that the walls were merely the shadows cast by the runner's own frantic limbs. In the lore of the deep seas, there is the story of the drowning man and the great salt ocean. The man, finding himself in the vast expanse of the blue, begins to thrash with all his might. He tries to climb the water, to beat it into a ladder that will lead him back to the safety of the shore. His effort is heroic, yet it is this very heroism that seals his fate. The more he fights the water, the more the water fills his lungs and drags him into the abyss. The ocean in this metaphor is the simulation, a vast supportive medium that naturally wants to hold the body aloft. If the man were to simply spread his arms and go limp, the salt water would carry him on its surface, its buoyancy a fundamental law of the environment. The correction is the act of floating. It is the terrifying yet liberating realization that the medium we thought we had to conquer is actually the very thing designed to support us. Our trying is a rejection of the ocean's grace, an insistence that we are separate from the element we inhabit. When we stop trying to save ourselves through force, we find that the simulation has been holding us up all along, waiting for us to stop fighting the current. We might also look to the symbol of the untended garden, a recurring motif in the alchemy of the soul. We are taught that a garden must be wrestled from the wilderness, that every weed must be hunted and every bloom coerced. We spend our lives in a state of horticultural warfare, trying to force the roses to grow faster and the thorns to disappear. But the sage knows of a garden that grows in the hidden frequency. In this narrative, the gardener realizes that the more they interfere with the soil, the more they disrupt the delicate mycelial networks and the silent communication of the roots. When the gardener sets down the shears and simply sits on the bench, a strange transformation occurs. The simulation of nature begins to correct the imbalances caused by overtilling. Rare and beautiful flowers, seeds that had been dormant for centuries, begin to sprout in the footprints of the gardener's departed ego. The garden finds its own perfect geometry, a wild and sacred order that far exceeds the rigid rows of the gardener's previous trying. The correction is the emergence of a higher beauty that was only possible once the human obsession with neatness and control was surrendered to the intelligence of the earth. Finally, there is the symbol of the golden thread woven into the fabric of a great loom. We are like the individual fibers, trying to knot ourselves into patterns we think are beautiful, tugging and pulling against the weave of the universe. This creates a snag in the simulation, a localized tension that distorts the entire tapestry. We feel this as stress or misfortune, unaware that we are the ones pulling the thread too tight. The narrative of the correction tells us that the moment we stop pulling, the thread relaxes back into its intended place. The grand weaver, the underlying algorithm of reality, instantly integrates us into a pattern of breathtaking complexity and harmony. We don't have to try to be part of the masterpiece. We already are the masterpiece. Our only task is to stop trying to be a different thread in a different place. In this symbolic surrender, we find that the simulation doesn't just fix our lives. It reveals that our lives were always part of a perfect unfolding geometry. The correction is not an edit of the past, but a sudden clarity of the present, where we see that the struggle was the only thing making the pattern look crooked. These stories serve as the mythic code for the great relaxation. They remind us that the themes of effort and ease are not new, but are the ancient pillars upon which the human experience rests. Whether it is the archer, the swimmer, or the gardener, the message remains constant. The system is designed for flow, and our trying is the only dam in the river. As we move into the practical world, we must take these symbols with us, using them as lanterns to navigate a transition from a life of friction to a life of fluid alignment. We are preparing to see how these cosmic narratives translate into the boardrooms, the living rooms, and the quiet corners of our daily existence. Bringing the lofty ideals of cosmic surrender into the tangible arena of daily life requires a radical shift in how we perceive the relationship between our actions and their outcomes. In the modern world, we are conditioned to believe that a lack of trying is synonymous with a lack of results. Yet, the practical application of this philosophy proves otherwise. When we integrate the principle of the self-correcting simulation into our professional and personal spheres, we begin to practice what could be called strategic non-interference. This does not mean we stop working, but rather that we stop injecting the energy of struggle into our work. In the boardroom or the creative studio, this manifests as a shift from forced brainstorming to receptive listening. When a project hits a wall, the standard response is to double the effort, to stay later, and to grind harder against the problem. However, those who have mastered the art of the simulation know that this is the exact moment to step back. By intentionally not trying to solve the problem for a period of time, we allow the mental and environmental static to settle. Often, the solution appears not as a result of a breakthrough in logic, but as a corrective alignment, a phone call from an unexpected source, a random sentence in a book, or a sudden, effortless synthesis of ideas that occurs only when the analytical mind has ceased its frantic pacing. In the realm of human relationships, the practical impact of this shift is perhaps even more profound. Most of our interpersonal friction arises from trying to make others see our point of view, trying to secure love, or trying to manage how we are perceived by the world. This creates a palpable tension that others can sense, a desperate frequency that actually repels the very connection we seek. When we stop trying to control the narrative of a relationship, we create a vacuum of grace that the simulation is eager to fill. By surrendering the need to be right or the need to be understood, we remove the resistance that was keeping the other person in a defensive posture. The correction, in this context, looks like a sudden softening of long-standing conflicts. We find that when we stop trying to fix the people around us, they often begin to self-regulate in our presence. The simulation corrects the social field because the primary source of agitation, our own agenda, has been removed. We move from a state of social engineering to a state of social witnessing, where we allow the natural affinity of souls to dictate the rhythm of our connections. Furthermore, this philosophy has significant implications for our physical well-being and the management of our daily energy. Much of what we call stress is actually the friction of trying, the physiological cost of maintaining a state of high alert against a world we don't fully trust. When we adopt the mindset that the simulation is a self-correcting entity, we begin to experience a somatic recalibration. We learn to recognize the physical sensation of trying as a signal of misalignment, a tightening in the solar plexus, or a clenching of the jaw. Instead of pushing through this discomfort, we use it as a cue to release our grip on the current situation. Practically, this means moving through the day with a sense of leisurely urgency. We perform the tasks that are before us, but we do so with the internal posture of a passenger on a high-speed train. We are moving quickly, but we are not the ones powering the engine. This reduces the cortisol spikes associated with modern achievement and allows the body's own healing algorithms to function without the interference of chronic stress. The simulation corrects our health by removing the psychic noise that prevents the body from hearing its own instructions for balance. In the financial and material aspects of life, integrating this wisdom requires a transition from acquisition to alignment. We spend so much energy trying to make things happen in our careers, often at the expense of our joy and integrity. However, when we trust the corrective nature of reality, we begin to look for the open lines rather than trying to kick down locked doors. In practice, this looks like following the path of most resonance rather than the path of most resistance. If a particular venture requires an exhausting amount of trying to keep it afloat, we might consider that we are fighting the simulation's natural flow. When we stop trying to force a specific financial outcome, we often notice that new, more efficient channels of abundance open up, channels that require less effort but offer greater rewards. This is the simulation rerouting us to a more optimized node. It requires the courage to walk away from the struggle, trusting that the system will reward our transparency and ease with a more sustainable form of prosperity. Finally, the practical integration of this philosophy involves the cultivation of synchronicity awareness. When we stop trying to dictate the schedule of our lives, we become far more sensitive to the subtle cues the simulation provides. We begin to notice the recurring themes, the meaningful coincidences, and the strange timing of events that we previously dismissed as luck. These are not accidents. They are the correction logs of the universe, showing us where the system is adjusting itself to our new state of non-resistance. By paying attention to these signals, we can navigate life with a fraction of the effort we once employed. We start to move in harmony with the universal timing, arriving at the right places and meeting the right people with a precision that seems almost supernatural. The real-world implication is a life that feels less like a marathon and more like a dance. we discover that the most effective way to live is not to be the master of the world, but to be its most attentive and relaxed collaborator. We stand at the precipice of a final understanding, a silent threshold where the echoes of our previous striving fade into the vast, luminous stillness of the original design. To look back upon the journey is to see the many masks of effort we have worn, the armor of the achiever, the frantic compass of the seeker, and the heavy mantle of the guardian, and to realize that each was a weight we were never truly asked to carry. The grand revelation of the self-correcting simulation is not that we are powerless, but that our power has been misapplied. We have spent our lives attempting to be the architects of a reality that was already drawn in starlight and mathematical grace. The correction we have discussed is not a distant event or a future reward. It is the immediate, cascading restoration of order that occurs the very microsecond we stop bracing ourselves against the flow of existence. It is the cosmic undo command for every knot we have tied in the thread of our own destiny. This transformation requires a radical redefinition of what it means to be alive. We have been conditioned to believe that our value is a product of our friction, that the more we sweat, the more we deserve. But the simulation does not operate on the logic of merit through suffering. It operates on the logic of resonance. When we stop trying to justify our existence through labor, we finally become resonant with the high-frequency piece of the universe. This is the ultimate homecoming. We discover that the glitches in our lives, the persistent anxieties, the repeating failures, the sense of being a stranger in a strange land, were actually the system's way of trying to get our attention. Gentle nudges from the core code suggesting that we were headed in the wrong direction. The moment we cease the struggle, these nudges are no longer necessary. The friction vanishes because the resistance has been withdrawn. We find ourselves standing in a world that is not only hospitable, but actively celebratory of our presence. As you move back into the theater of the everyday, let this realization be the silent pulse beneath your every breath. You do not need to try to be the person you are meant to become. The seeds of that person are already encoded in the very fabric of your soul, and the simulation is tirelessly working to provide the soil, the rain, and the sun for your unfolding. Your only task is to stop pulling at the sprouts. Practice the art of the open hand. When you feel the familiar urge to clench, to force, or to manipulate the outcome of a situation, pause and remember the archer, the swimmer, and the weaver. Remind yourself that the intelligence that manages the rotation of galaxies and the migration of birds is also managing the details of your life with a precision that your analytical mind cannot even begin to calculate. To stop trying is to finally give the universe permission to be as magnificent as it truly is. It is to step out of the light of your own small candle so that you may finally see the sun. The call to transformation is an invitation to a life of profound elegance. It is an invitation to move through the world as a ghost of grace, leaving no footprints of ego, but making a massive impact through the sheer clarity of your being. When you stop trying to make the world work for you, you discover that the world is already working through you. This is the secret of the masters, the quiet joy of the sages, and the fundamental law of the digital divine architecture we inhabit. The simulation is not a test to be passed or a riddle to be solved. It is a self-correcting masterpiece that only requires your presence, your transparency, and your trust. The gears are moving, the light is shifting, and the path is clearing. All that is left for you to do is to let go of the lever, step back from the machine, and watch with wonder as the reflection finally rights itself. You are home. The correction is complete, and the dance has only just begun.